You've probably heard of imaginary numbers before, and they won't play too big of a part in our unit, but I did want to remind you of what they were. So an imaginary number it's not actually imaginary. It has a definition. So you usually can't take the square root of a negative number. So we call the square root of -1 I. So that's all it is. That's what an imaginary number is. So if you have something, for example, like let's say when you're doing the quadratic equation, you have x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, that's a minus, all over 2a. Let's say somehow that you end up with x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times 6, all over 2. So when you simplify that, you would get 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus 24 over 2. But notice that you can't take the square root of a negative normally because this is going to be -20. So the reason the imaginary numbers are helpful is because we can simplify it using I. So we would have 2 plus or minus, and then square root of 20I. So instead of saying the square root of -20, like we would up here, we say the square root of 20 and then times I to signify that it was an imaginary number, and then divide by 2. In this case, this would be if we had x squared minus 2x plus 6. So this is what we would be factoring in order to use this equation. This would mean that we could actually factor this as equal to, and then 2 plus the square root of 20 I over 2. And you also have to do something called the conjugate, which is basically the opposite. So instead of plus, we're going to put minus square root of 20 I over 2. So this mostly comes into play with the quadratic equation or quadratic formula. But I did want to remind you of its existence, and that sometimes if it doesn't work really nicely, it might just be because there aren't any real roots. They don't exist in the actual world. They're just imaginary numbers. So just a quick review of imaginary numbers. Like I said, it won't play too big of a deal, but it might show up on the benchmark. So hopefully that helps you to remember what I does.